Hey, AP World History people, I'm going to go over period 5 with you and just go over all the major things that are going down and help you get focused on what to expect on your final and AP exam. First of all, it's always important to remember the years of the actual era. So this goes from roughly 1750 to 1900. And we'll explore all the major topics of industrialization, imperialism, revolutions, rebellions, and then also changing human population topics. So let's start with key concept number 1, industrialization and global capitalism. These would be major economic changes to the world. We know that economic changes always follow up with political and social changes as well. So industrialization was a big deal because it altered the production of goods. It altered where they were produced, how they were produced, who was doing it, where you were working, and like we said, had all kinds of impacts on the broader culture. The process was a gradual one. It's important to remember that it began in Great Britain and really took a period of 150 years to really take root globally around the world. The first key point is just understanding how industrialization changed how goods were produced. Previously, people produced goods in their homes, largely artisans, handcraft items. So even if you were weaving or making swords, many times this was a cottage industry, as they call it. A variety of factors led to the rise of industrial production. First of all, you have to understand the growing demand for goods in the world. And in mercantilism, previously, the goal is to sell final goods. And so the only way to make more money is to produce more final goods. So people are trying to find faster ways to produce more stuff so they can profit. Also, with that would be the development of new machinery such as steam engines and the combustion engine. And this is going to make production more prevalent. It's going to transform how quickly people can produce things. So the steam engine is kind of a misconception. A lot of people think of it just as like the engine on the train, if you will, but that in fact is going to fuel many types of machines within factories themselves. And so the steam engine is a leading contributor to the Industrial Revolution. Also, the development of new types of energy and fuel and the use of coal and fossil fuels to fuel these steam engines. Some other factors we talked about, like whether or not a country industrialized or not, may depend on the geographic distribution of coal, iron, and timber, which were needed. Also, whether or not they had a surplus of population. So the fact that Great Britain and some of these places in Europe had a growing population in their cities allowed for the labor force that would support industrialization. And access to raw materials and colonies. The factory system is changing how people work. And this just means, again, instead of at home, that your work probably will be conducted in a factory where you are making products. And that work is changing because in a factory system, specialized tasks actually increase. We think of it as like mundane, boring stuff, but in reality, the tasks themselves are much more specific. Think of the assembly line, you have somebody doing a very narrow task. We know that the industrial production began mostly in Europe, especially in Great Britain, but eventually will spread to other regions of the world. Understanding the addition of the United States, Russia, Japan, and Germany as well to the industrialization process is important. The first wave focused on textiles, whereas the second wave of the Industrial Revolution furthered that on to topics such as steel, chemicals, electricity, and precision machinery. And this is where weaponry comes into play too, and war needs. They're going to increasingly turn to the production of those items. Also related to industrialization is new patterns of global trade. And that means that as the economy is now global and we have global trade routes and people seeking raw materials. So just the seeking of these raw materials to be able to produce the finished goods is going to drive people to further colonize and get raw materials in places if they don't have them on their own. The growth of export economies, what that means is that specialized and mass producing natural resources. So they're making things and they're exporting these finished goods to other areas of the world. Resources that they were seeking: cotton, rubber, palm oil, sugar, wheat, meat, guano, metals. All of these are necessary for industrial production at that time, and so they're seeking out these resources to make those finished goods. This point here talks about the steam-powered industrial production in Europe and the United States, meaning that whoever has the steam engines and the steam-powered technology, they are going to increase production and industrialize the fastest. Therefore, they're going to share a greater portion of manufacturing and industrialization, which means they also are going to have a greater market share then of all the goods that are produced. So this is going to benefit Europe, the United States, and Japan, but those places that were very late to industrialize are going to suffer. The global economy of the 19th century expanded dramatically from the previous period due to increased exchanges of raw materials and finished goods. Opium was produced in the Middle East and was exported to China. Cotton was grown in Egypt, the Caribbean, and North America, and exported to Great Britain and other countries. And the need for specialized and limited metals for industrial production, as well as demand of precious metals and gems, led to new mining centers. So we have copper mines in Mexico, for example, and gold and diamond mines in South Africa. So the financing of industrialization, the big question kind of is, well, does government fund it or do private individuals fund it? And people answer that differently, empires answer that differently, but we had this emerging theory away from mercantilism of capitalism. And capitalism is the belief that private property is important and that businesses and business growth should be driven by individual and private wealth as opposed to like government-supported wealth and government-supported industry. So capitalism was a new economic theory. Adam Smith is the most famous of the founding thinkers of capitalist theory. He wrote Wealth of Nations, and quotes about capitalism are almost always on the AP exams who do understand it's a new economic theory that is supporting the individual ownership and support of industrial development. And the concept of laissez-faire, which means hands-off, that government is going to keep its hands off the business dealings of new industry and a new industrialization. Capitalism also, as we know, is going to support wealth inequality because that's just the natural outcome of it. And that will come under debate. There will be backlash to capitalist theory and the growing gap in income. The global nature of trade and production contributed to transnational businesses. So for the first time, we have businesses that are operating in more than one country. That's a new development. An example of that would be the United Fruit Company, based in the US, but operating in Central America. Other elements of capitalism, institutions such as the stock market, insurance, gold standards, different types of corporations are being formed. I mean, these are just new ideas of like, how do we conduct business if it's privately owned? And these were the new ideas and inventions of the time. Do make sure you are aware of developments in transportation and communication, including the establishment of railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and canals. The Transcontinental Railroad in the United States would be an example. Also, Russia as well. We know that was a major development. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal in Egypt. So all of these are new transportation technologies and will lead to greater globalization and greater exchanges. So capitalism and global capitalism is going to create responses because not everybody is supportive of the outcomes of capitalism. In the factory system, we know that working conditions were quite harsh, and because there's kind of an oversupply then, they were paid low wages. So labor unions will be a result of this. The labor unions will be created to collectively bargain for the rights of workers, whether it's higher wages or whether it's better working conditions. So that is one response. Another response would be an alternative theory to capitalism, and that is socialism as a broad theory, and then communism. And just to clarify, the AP exam writers, they usually approach this topic as an umbrella topic, meaning that a socialist topic is a broad theory about there should be more supports for individual basic needs of the individual. Communism would be a narrow thought within that, which takes that to a more extreme level where all private property, there is no such thing, and that government owns the resources and will ensure equal distribution of that, make sure that everybody has a share in the profit. As we know, communist theory is very complex, and it does involve a progression to the point in theory where there is no longer government needed because there's equal distribution and you don't need this like small group of people controlling things. But we know throughout history that it's never transitioned to that point. And so in real world communism, then the government and a small group of people remain in control of property and business. And then also just understanding the components of that. So the proletariat, the working poor, who in communist theory are going to rise up and take over the property of the bourgeoisie, capitalists, and business owners, property owners, and seize all the means of production. And just remember that communism as a theory, really it does embrace violence. It is also atheist by doctrine. So this is incredibly threatening, if you will, to Western society that's largely Christian and capitalist. Other responses around the world. So in China, in the Ottoman Empire, we know that elites in government resisted economic change because they are just trying to maintain the status quo and they don't want to let go of the privilege that they've had. So the Tanzimat movement in Ottoman Empire would be an example of struggle within the Ottoman Empire where initially the Tanzimat movement was to industrialize and reform the Ottoman economy. However, traditionalists within the Ottoman Empire are going to entrench their power and try to hold that back. We know that in the Qing Empire, there's an attempt, the self-strengthening movement was an attempt to keep things Chinese, essentially, and kind of rid themselves of foreign influence. We know that industrialization happens sometimes as a result of state sponsorship. And what that means is that the government itself sponsored industrialization as a goal of the state. Meiji Japan is a major, major topic that you need to be aware of. And that is after the arrival of the United States and Matthew Perry basically forcing their way into Japan, where previously Japan, under the Tokugawa shogunate, was isolated. They had a policy, strict isolationist policy, to really control the infiltration of Western culture, Christian culture, and the Western traders, and very deliberately did not want the Western industrialists undermining their cultural unity and their systems. However, with the arrival of the United States and the demand, really, with the battleships parked there, that they open up their ports for trade, there's a recognition in Japan that they have to change or they will essentially be conquered and dominated. And so the Meiji restoration and reform in Japan is really an attempt to industrialize and modernize and accept elements of westernization that would allow them to be successful, but then reject elements that they did not want. And so Meiji Japan sees the adoption of like Western style clothing, education, but it does retain certain Japanese elements such as religion and cuisine. Zaibatsu would be their answer, and that is where entrenched, wealthy, former noble families then are taking over industrial development and big industrial complexes. In Russia, we know that the leaders, Peter and Catherine the Great, they accept foreign loans and foreign investment as a strategy to get industrialization going, but they also then are going to control who owns the factories, where the factories are. We know that in Egypt, there was a major movement by Muhammad Ali and Egyptian leaders to rid themselves of outside control and industrialize, although not wholly successful. Criticisms of global capitalism. the wealth and the social question, and what do we do with the urban poor? We know that in Germany, they adopted some state pensions and public health plans. In Great Britain, they extended suffrage to all men and established public education in many of these nations, and this was kind of an attempt to placate the working poor. We also know that there were new social classes, such as the middle class, the proletariat. We know that family dynamics and gender roles changed, and that women had to take on a greater role sometimes at home. That the working conditions were poor in the factories. That um, the rapid urbanization that will take place and the influx to the cities, and just the harsh living conditions of people living there. Cholera and the cholera epidemic in these cities in Europe as a result of the lack of hygiene would be a topic to understand as a consequence of this rapid industrialization.